In the autumn of 1095, a voice rose before a crowd in Clermont, and Europe began to move. Not as one kingdom, not as one army, but as a continent of restless souls, frightened knights, hungry peasants, ambitious lords, and guilty men searching for a way to make violence feel clean. Pope Urban II did not simply ask for soldiers. He offered a road eastward, a road toward Jerusalem, a road where bloodshed could be spoken of as service, and killing could be wrapped in the language of salvation. That is the mystery at the heart of the First Crusade. How did war become holy? To understand that, we have to slow down. We have to stand for a moment inside a world where fear was ordinary, death was close, and sin was not an idea but a weight people believed they carried into eternity. Clermont was not the beginning of violence in Europe. It was the moment that violence was given a destination. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because this story is not only about armies crossing mountains and deserts, it is about belief under pressure, about a church trying to command a fractured world, about warriors who had been taught to fight, suddenly told that their swords might open the gates of heaven, and somewhere between prayer and conquest, between pilgrimage and massacre, medieval Europe discovered a terrifying possibility, that the road to redemption could be paved with bodies. Chapter 2. A Europe restless beneath the cross. Long before anyone in Clermont heard the Pope's voice, Europe was already a place trained to expect violence. Not constant chaos, not the simple darkness of old clichés, but a hard, local, anxious world where power often lived no farther away than the nearest fortified hill. Castles rose across the landscape like clenched fists. A lord's authority might stretch only as far as his riders could enforce it. Justice was uneven. Protection was personal. A harvest could fail. A neighbor could raid. A family feud could become a private war. And for ordinary people, the difference between politics and robbery was not always easy to see. This was the late 11th century, a world of small territories, sworn loyalties, fragile harvests, and restless armed men. Kings existed, but many were not yet the commanding figures later centuries would imagine. Much of daily life depended on local bonds, between lord and vassal, village and monastery, warrior and patron. The countryside did not belong to peace. It belonged to whoever could defend it, claim it, or take it. And at the center of this unstable order stood the knight. We should be careful with that word, because the knight of 1095 was not yet the polished figure of later romance, riding through literature with a shining conscience and a convenient code of honor. He was a mounted fighter, often from the lower or middle layers of the aristocracy, trained for war because war was his profession, his inheritance, and sometimes his only ladder upward. His horse, armor, weapons, and companions required money. His status required recognition. His world rewarded courage, loyalty, aggression, and the ability to seize advantage before someone else seized it first. For such men, violence was not a breakdown of society. It was one of society's operating systems. This is one of the first things modern viewers often misunderstand about the First Crusade. It did not summon peaceful men into a sudden madness. It spoke to a culture where armed conflict already carried social meaning. Feuds, raids, castle wars, struggles over inheritance, disputes between rival lords. These were not rare interruptions. They were part of the machinery of power. But that machinery was beginning to trouble the Christian conscience. The church did not stand outside this world like a clean observer. Bishops were landholders. Monasteries owned estates. Noble families placed sons in church offices. The sacred and the political were not separate rooms. They shared the same walls. Still, many churchmen looked at the violence of the warrior class and saw a spiritual crisis. Christian knights were killing other Christians. They were burning fields that fed Christian peasants. They were seizing goods from churches, threatening clergy, dragging local communities into cycles of revenge that could last for generations. The problem was not that Europe lacked religion. It was saturated with it. Bells marked the day. Saints guarded towns. Relics drew pilgrims. The fear of damnation was woven into ordinary decisions. People did not have to be told that the soul mattered. They lived inside a universe where the soul was the most serious possession they had. That is why the violence mattered so much. A knight might spend his life doing things his faith told him placed his soul in danger. The same hand that gave alms could hold a sword. The same man who endowed a monastery might have spent years raiding his neighbors. Medieval people were perfectly capable of contradiction, perhaps more honestly than we are. They could be devout and brutal, generous and predatory, terrified of judgment and unwilling to abandon the habits that gave them power. So when Urban II eventually offered warriors a way to fight under the sign of the cross, he was not inventing their hunger for combat. He was answering a tension that already existed inside them. There were other pressures too, quieter, but no less important. Europe's population had begun to grow in many regions. New land was being cleared. Younger sons of noble families could not always expect the same inheritance as their elder brothers. Ambition pressed against custom. The church's reform movement was challenging older patterns of authority, especially the influence of lay rulers over church offices. At the same time, famine and insecurity remained familiar possibilities. Life was local, but anxiety traveled well. A poor harvest did not need a theology to become frightening. Hunger made its own arguments. Disease needed no sermon. Debt could trap a household as effectively as a prison. For some, the idea of leaving home for a sacred expedition may have sounded reckless. For others, it may have sounded like the first open door they had ever seen. This is where the Crusade begins to look less like a single command from above and more like a spark falling onto dry ground. Urban's sermon mattered. It mattered enormously. But sermons do not move tens of thousands of people unless the listeners are already carrying something combustible. Europe was full of men and women who understood hardship, guilt, uncertainty, and hope in intensely religious terms. They did not divide the world into practical and spiritual as neatly as we often do. To them, a failed harvest, a military defeat, a pilgrimage, a vow, a sin, and a miracle could all belong to the same moral universe. The cross, then, was not merely a symbol stitched onto clothing. It was a public mark that a person had entered a different kind of story. And that story had deep appeal because it solved, or appeared to solve, several problems at once. It gave warriors a cause greater than local rivalry. It gave the church a way to redirect violence rather than simply condemn it. It gave the anxious a path toward penance. It gave the ambitious a road lined with possibility. It gave the poor and the marginal, at least for a moment, the sense that history itself had opened a place for them. Of course, none of this made the movement pure. Mixed motives are not a modern invention. A man could kneel in tears and still dream of land. He could seek forgiveness and still enjoy the thought of glory. He could believe he was serving God while also serving his family's interests. The First Crusade drew strength precisely because it did not require one motive. It could gather many desires beneath one sacred sign. That is part of what made it so powerful and so dangerous. By 1095, Europe was not waiting calmly for a pope to disturb it. It was already restless beneath the cross. Armed, devout, divided, frightened, and searching for a language that could make its violence meaningful. Urban II would provide that language, but he did not create the restlessness. He named it. Chapter 3. The Church's War Against War. The strange thing about the First Crusade is that it did not grow only from Europe's appetite for war. It also grew from attempts to restrain it. That may sound like a contradiction, and in a way it is. But medieval history often moves through contradictions rather than around them. The Church looked at the violence of the knightly world and tried, again and again, to place boundaries around it. Not because churchmen were always gentle, and certainly not because the Church was separate from power, but because uncontrolled private warfare was tearing at the Christian society they claimed to shepherd. A knight who plundered a monastery was not merely committing theft, he was violating sacred order. A lord who burned a peasant's field was not only damaging property, he was endangering the weak, whom Christian teaching said should be protected. A feud that spilled across villages could destroy the very communities that paid tithes, fed monasteries, and gathered beneath church bells. So the Church began to experiment with peace. One of the most important efforts was known as the Peace of God. It emerged especially in parts of France before the First Crusade, gathering bishops, abbots, nobles, and ordinary people around the idea that certain persons and places should be shielded from violence. Clergy, peasants, women, merchants, pilgrims, church lands. These were not supposed to be treated as legitimate targets in the endless quarrels of armed men. It was an ambitious idea, perhaps too ambitious. Because rules are easiest to proclaim in public, and hardest to enforce when a mounted warrior with hungry followers sees an undefended storehouse. Still, the peace of God mattered. It told knights that their violence was not morally neutral. It told communities that suffering under private war was not simply the way of the world. And it gave the Church a public role as the voice of order in a fragmented landscape. Then came another movement, the truce of God. If the peace of God tried to protect certain people and places, the truce of God tried to protect certain times. Warfare was to be restricted on holy days, during parts of the week, and in sacred seasons. Again, the exact rules varied by place and moment, and the evidence does not allow us to pretend that Europe suddenly became peaceful because bishops said it should. But the principle was important. Time itself was being divided between the permitted and the forbidden, between violence and restraint. Imagine what that meant. A knight might still fight, but he was increasingly asked to see his fighting as something answerable to God, not merely to his Lord, not merely to family honor, not merely to revenge, to God. This is where the road to crusade begins to appear in outline. The Church had not yet abolished violence. It had failed to do so, if that had ever been the real hope. But it had done something subtler. It had taught warriors to think about violence in religious categories. It had taught them that some acts of force could be condemned, some delayed, some regulated, and eventually, some blessed. That last step was the most dangerous. The First Crusade did not come from a society with no moral rules about war. It came from a society that had been arguing fiercely about those rules. What made Urban II's call so powerful was that it did not simply tell knights to stop fighting. Many had heard that before. Instead, it offered them a way to fight rightly. Here was the shift, from restraining the sword to redirecting it. A knight who might have raided a Christian neighbor could instead ride against a distant enemy described as threatening fellow Christians and sacred places. A culture of violence could be given a new channel. A guilty warrior could imagine that the very skills that endangered his soul might now help redeem it. This was not just clever politics, it was a profound moral transformation. And it was not entirely cynical. That is worth saying plainly. Many churchmen genuinely feared for Christian communities. Many genuinely wanted to reduce violence within Europe. Many believed that defending Christians in the East and recovering access to holy places could be a righteous cause. To flatten all of this into manipulation is too easy, and it misses the uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous ideas are often born from sincere concerns. The Church's war against war did not eliminate the warrior's world. It baptized a path through it. It tried to turn destructive force away from Christian society and toward those marked as enemies of Christendom. But once violence is given sacred permission, it rarely stays within the careful boundaries imagined by those who authorize it. That is the shadow already forming here. For years, the Church had told knights, "Do not kill these people. Do not fight on these days. Do not violate these places." At Clermont, the message would change. It would become, "Go there, fight them, and do it for the salvation of your soul." To the medieval mind, this did not necessarily sound like hypocrisy. It could sound like resolution. The sword that had been a problem could become an instrument. The restless knight could become a pilgrim. The private feud could be replaced by a public holy cause. But the transformation came at a cost. Because when war is treated as a regrettable necessity, it can still be questioned. When war is treated as sacred service, questioning it becomes harder. Doubt begins to look like weakness. Mercy can look like betrayal. The enemy stops being merely political or military. He becomes a figure in a cosmic drama. And in such a drama, ordinary limits begin to loosen. The peace and truce of God were meant to protect Christian society from its own violence. Yet they helped create the language that made crusading possible. They trained Europe to imagine violence as something that could be morally sorted, spiritually measured, and placed under divine command. This is the paradox at the center of the age. The First Crusade was not the opposite of the Church's peace movements. It was, in one unsettling sense, their descendant. The Church tried to tame the sword. Instead, it taught the sword to pray. Chapter 4. The Emperor's Plea from the East. Far from the fields and castles of Western Europe, another Christian world was trying to survive. To the people of the Latin West, Constantinople could seem almost unreal. Ancient, wealthy, ceremonial, difficult to understand, and more Roman than anything they knew at home. Its walls were famous. Its churches glittered. Its emperor carried a title that reached back into a past the West had mostly lost. This was not a frontier outpost begging for rescue. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, heir to the eastern half of Rome. And for centuries it had stood between Western Christendom and the great powers of the Near East. But by the late 11th century, that empire had been badly shaken. The disaster most often named is the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where Byzantine forces were defeated by the Seljuk Turks. The battle itself was important, but its aftermath mattered even more. The empire did not simply lose a battlefield, it lost stability. Civil conflicts, rival claimants, and political disorder weakened Byzantine control over Anatolia, the great land bridge of Asia Minor. Turkish powers expanded into regions that had long supplied the empire with soldiers, taxes, and strategic depth. For Constantinople, this was not an abstract problem. Anatolia was not a distant colony. It was the shield behind the shield, the space that kept danger away from the capital. When that space fractured, the empire's security changed. By the 1090s, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had done much to restore imperial strength. But he still faced a difficult military situation. He needed men. More specifically, he needed disciplined military assistants, Western knights and soldiers who could help him recover territory and push back Turkish forces. This kind of request was not impossible to imagine. Byzantium and the West had quarrels, suspicions, and theological tensions, but they were not strangers. Mercenaries and envoys crossed between their worlds. Political necessity often made room for uncomfortable cooperation. What Alexios wanted, as far as we can tell, was help he could use. What he received was history with a fever. This is one of the great misunderstandings of the First Crusade. The Byzantine appeal did not arrive in the West as a fully formed plan to send enormous armies across continents to seize Jerusalem. Alexios appears to have sought military support for imperial aims, especially in Anatolia. But once his need passed through the religious imagination of the West, it became something larger, stranger, and less controllable. A request for aid became a summons to holy pilgrimage. A frontier war became a road to salvation. The emperor had asked for a tool. The West began forging a movement. The difference between those things would haunt the crusade from the beginning. Pope Urban II understood the Byzantine plea in his own way. It offered him a practical occasion and a spiritual argument. Eastern Christians, he could say, were suffering. The churches of the East needed help. The enemies of Christendom had advanced. Here was a cause that could unite knights who might otherwise spend their lives fighting one another. Here was a direction in which the violence of Europe could be turned. But the farther the message traveled, the more it changed. Sermons are living things. They pass from pulpit to road, from road to market, from market to memory. A careful appeal can become a rumor can become a vow can become a crowd. By the time the crusading idea spread through towns and villages, it carried emotional force beyond anything Alexios could easily command. Many who took the cross were not thinking in Byzantine strategic terms. They were thinking of sin, penance, Christ's suffering, the Holy Sepulchre, the rescue of sacred places, and the possibility that their own violent lives might be remade by a journey east. Constantinople wanted allies. It would soon watch pilgrims arrive with armies behind them. The difference mattered because Byzantium and the Crusaders did not share the same map of meaning. To Alexios, lands recovered from Turkish control were former imperial territories. If Western armies helped take them, they should be restored to the empire. That was the logic of Byzantine sovereignty. But to many crusaders, conquest under the cross could feel like a divine gift. especially when paid for with starvation, disease, and the bodies of companions left along the road. Both sides could claim reason. Both sides could feel betrayed, and both sides carried stereotypes of the other. Westerners often viewed the Byzantines as overly subtle, wealthy, suspicious, and perhaps not quite martial enough by Western standards. Byzantines, for their part, had reasons to regard Western knights as crude, dangerous, unpredictable, and hungry for land. These are broad impressions, not universal truths, but they shaped behavior. Trust was thin before the armies even arrived. Here the story becomes less like a simple alliance and more like a tense negotiation conducted under sacred pressure. Alexios needed the Crusaders, but he also had to fear them. A large armed movement entering imperial territory could be useful if controlled and disastrous if not. Urban needed the emperor's crisis, but the crusade he preached quickly exceeded the emperor's purpose. The Crusaders needed Byzantine roads, markets, ships, intelligence, and diplomacy. Yet many disliked the idea of submitting their victories to imperial claims. No one fully owned the movement once it began. That is the key. The First Crusade was not born from one man's plan. It formed at the crossing point of several anxieties: Byzantine military need, papal ambition, Western knightly restlessness, popular religious longing, and the sacred geography of Jerusalem. Alexios's plea was one thread in the knot, but without it the timing might have been very different. It gave Urban a crisis to answer. It made Eastern war feel immediate. It transformed distant reports of suffering into a call for action. Still, the emperor could not have known what his request would become. He could not have known that men and women from far beyond his control would begin selling property, taking vows, and sewing crosses onto their clothing. He could not have known that popular preachers would stir crowds beyond the discipline of princes. He could not have known that the road to aid Byzantium would become, in Western minds, the road to Jerusalem. There is a quiet tragedy in that. A plea meant to restore order helped release something disorderly. A diplomatic request became a spiritual avalanche. And between Constantinople and the armed pilgrims coming east, a question began to form that no oath would ever fully settle. Were the Crusaders serving the empire, serving the Pope, serving God, or serving themselves? The answer, inconveniently, was yes. Chapter 5. Urban II and the Politics of Salvation. Pope Urban II did not stand at Clermont as a dreamer detached from the world. He was a churchman, a reformer, a strategist, and a survivor of one of the most bitter conflicts of his age. To understand his call to crusade, we have to resist the temptation to see him as only one thing: either a saintly pastor moved by suffering in the East, or a cold political operator dressing ambition in sacred words. Medieval power rarely separated itself that neatly. Urban lived in a church struggling to define its own authority. The papacy had been locked in conflict with secular rulers over who had the right to appoint bishops and control church offices. This was not a minor administrative dispute. Bishops held land, wealth, influence, and loyalty. Whoever controlled them could shape kingdoms. The reforming papacy wanted a church less dependent on lay rulers, more disciplined, more universal, and more clearly obedient to Rome. So when Urban preached the crusade, he was also speaking from within a larger campaign: to make the Pope not merely one religious leader among others, but the commanding voice of Latin Christendom. That does not mean the crusade was fake. It means the sermon had more than one purpose. Urban could respond to the Byzantine emperor's request for aid. He could present himself as defender of Eastern Christians. He could call violent knights away from fighting one another. He could offer a form of armed pilgrimage that placed the Pope, not a king, at the center of a great Christian enterprise. And he could do something even more daring. He could link military action to the deepest fear of medieval life, the fate of the soul. This was politics, but it was politics conducted in the language of eternity. That is one reason the crusading message traveled so powerfully. Urban was not offering ordinary war. Ordinary war was everywhere, and everyone knew its costs. He was offering war with a changed moral meaning. A man who took the cross was not simply joining an army. He was making a vow. He was stepping into the role of pilgrim. He was placing his body on a road that promised hardship, danger, and spiritual reward. For warriors burdened by guilt, this was extraordinary. The Church had long taught that killing, even in circumstances that might be defended, placed the soul in peril. Yet here was a cause in which the sword could be framed as service. The contradiction did not vanish. It was transformed. The violence remained real, but its interpretation changed. The battlefield could be imagined as a place of penance. Urban's genius, and it is a troubling kind of genius, was to understand that salvation could move armies more effectively than plunder alone. Land and wealth mattered, ambition mattered, rivalries mattered, but a purely material explanation cannot fully account for the scale and endurance of the response. Many crusaders mortgaged or sold property to go. Many faced enormous risk with no guarantee of return. Some surely hoped for gain. Others may have had little idea what awaited them. But the spiritual promise gave the journey a force that ordinary military recruitment could not match. It made sacrifice meaningful. And that meaning gave Urban authority. A king could summon vassals for a campaign. A lord could demand service. But the Pope could speak across borders, across local loyalties, across the patchwork of feudal obligations. He could address counts, knights, monks, peasants, and townspeople as members of one wounded Christian body. In a fractured Europe, the Crusade briefly made unity imaginable. That unity was imperfect, unstable, and often violent, but the idea of it was powerful. Urban also understood the importance of Jerusalem, even if the first appeal from Byzantium had focused more immediately on military aid in the east. Jerusalem gave the movement its emotional center. A war to help an emperor might interest nobles. A pilgrimage to the city where Christ had suffered and risen could seize the imagination of everyone. The Pope's message turned geography into destiny. Here, again, we need caution. We do not possess a perfect transcript of Urban's speech at Clermont. The versions that survive were written later, shaped by memory, theology, and the success of the crusade itself. Different accounts emphasize different themes, so when we speak of Urban's exact words, we are standing on ground that is partly firm and partly reconstructed. What we can say with more confidence is that the message combined several elements: aid to Eastern Christians, the liberation or recovery of holy places, the redirection of knightly violence, and a spiritual reward for those who undertook the journey. That combination was new enough, bold enough, and emotionally charged enough to change the course of medieval history. It also created a problem no one could fully control. Once salvation was tied to armed action, the crusade became more than a campaign. It became a test of faith. To abandon it could feel like betraying a vow, To suffer on the road could seem like purification. To win could appear as divine approval. To lose might demand explanation, repentance, or someone to blame. This is how religious movements harden. Not because every believer is fanatical, not because every leader is dishonest, but because once human fear, public vows, sacred symbols, and collective hardship are fused together, they become difficult to separate. A crusader did not merely carry a weapon. He carried an interpretation of himself. Urban's politics of salvation worked because it met people at the point where their world was most vulnerable. Medieval Christians feared sin not as a private emotion, but as a cosmic danger. They feared disorder because it threatened both body and soul. They feared enemies abroad, but also judgment from above. The Crusade offered a single answer to many fears: go east, suffer, fight, and be remade. To modern ears, that answer may sound impossible. To many in 1095, it sounded like mercy. And that may be the most unsettling part. The First Crusade was not sold only through hatred. It was also sold through hope. Hope for forgiveness. Hope for unity. Hope that violence, the great sickness of the warrior class, might somehow become its cure. Hope that the road to Jerusalem could straighten the crooked life of a sinner. Urban II gave that hope a command. He turned anxiety into movement, penance into campaign, and papal authority into a force that could reach far beyond Rome. In doing so, he did not merely launch an expedition. He helped redefine what Latin Christendom believed it could do in the name of God. The sermon at Clermont did not place a sword into Europe's hand. The sword was already there. Urban placed a cross above it. Chapter 6. Jerusalem in the European imagination. Jerusalem was not simply a destination. For medieval Christians in Western Europe, it was a place most would never see, yet somehow already knew. They knew it through scripture, sermons, liturgy, pilgrimage stories, painted images, relics, and the yearly rhythm of worship. It lived in the mind before it appeared on any road. It was the city of David and Solomon, the city of Christ's suffering, the city of the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the promised return. It was history, prophecy, memory, and longing folded into one name. To say Jerusalem in the 11th century was not like naming an ordinary city. It was to touch the center of Christian time. That is why the Crusade could not remain only a military response to the Byzantine crisis. Anatolia mattered strategically. Eastern Christians mattered morally and politically. But Jerusalem gave the movement its emotional fire. It turned a campaign into pilgrimage. It gave people, who had never left their own region, a vision large enough to reorder their lives. Most medieval Europeans had little direct knowledge of the Levant. Their Jerusalem was partly real and partly imagined, made from sacred text and devotional habit. This does not mean it was false to them. On the contrary, imagined places can be more powerful than places measured by distance. A city known through prayer may feel closer than the next province. A tomb described every year in the language of salvation may seem more urgent than a lord's castle across the valley. Jerusalem was far away on a map, but near in the soul. That nearness mattered because medieval Christianity was deeply physical. Faith was not only an inward belief. It moved through bodies, places, objects, journeys, fasting, kneeling, touching, seeing. Pilgrimage had long been one of the ways Christians expressed devotion and penance. To travel to a holy site was to place the body into a sacred story. The hardship of the road could become part of the offering. Blisters, hunger, fear, and distance were not merely obstacles. They could be interpreted as signs that the journey meant something. Jerusalem was the highest form of that longing. A pilgrimage there was not casual travel. It was a movement toward the place where the central drama of Christian salvation had unfolded. To pray at the Holy Sepulchre, to stand near the remembered site of Christ's death and resurrection, was to collapse centuries of distance. The believer did not just think about sacred history, he entered its geography. Urban II's call drew power from this older habit. The Crusade did not invent pilgrimage, it armed it. That one change altered everything. A pilgrim usually traveled in humility, seeking penance, healing, or grace. A crusader also traveled under a vow, but with a sword, and with enemies named along the way. The result was a strange hybrid, an armed pilgrimage in which violence could be absorbed into the logic of devotion. This was not simply a military expedition with prayers attached. It was a devotional act with military consequences, and Jerusalem made that fusion feel possible. The city also answered a psychological need. Europe's warriors lived with contradiction. Their status came from violence, yet their faith warned them about sin. They defended churches and sometimes plundered them. They sought honor in battle and absolution in confession. Jerusalem offered a way to gather those contradictions into one grand movement. A knight could imagine that his dangerous skills had finally found their proper object. He could fight not for a petty border, not for a disputed inheritance, not for another lord's pride, but for the city of Christ. That idea had enormous moral force. It also carried enormous danger. Because once a city becomes a symbol of cosmic meaning, the people already living there can become strangely difficult to see. Jerusalem in the European imagination was filled with Christ, apostles, prophets, relics, miracles, and memory. But the real Jerusalem was also a living city, inhabited by Muslims, Christians, and Jews, governed within the political worlds of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was not an empty shrine waiting for Western grief. It was a human place. The crusading mind often struggled to hold both truths at once. This is one of the quiet tragedies of sacred geography. A place can be loved so intensely as an idea that its actual inhabitants become secondary to the dream. The more Jerusalem became the stage of redemption in Western preaching, the more its complexity could be flattened. It became less a city of streets, households, languages, and local histories, and more a prize in the drama of salvation. That does not mean every crusader thought crudely about it. Human motives are rarely so uniform. Some likely imagined Jerusalem with tears, some with fear, some with ambition, some with images borrowed from sermons they barely understood. Many may have held no clear geography in their minds at all, only the conviction that the city mattered beyond measure. But the effect was the same. Jerusalem pulled them eastward with a force no ordinary battlefield could produce. There is also a political brilliance in this. A war to defend Byzantium depended on trust in a distant emperor. A war for Jerusalem depended on no such personal loyalty. It belonged to every Christian imagination, a poor villager, a knight with debts, a count with lands, a monk preaching reform. All could understand Jerusalem as sacred, even if they understood nothing of Byzantine diplomacy. The city unified people who had almost nothing else in common. That unity was not peaceful. It did not erase rivalry or greed or confusion, but it gave the crusade a shared language. When men starved on the road, they could tell themselves they were suffering toward Jerusalem. When leaders argued, they argued under the shadow of Jerusalem. When the army seemed doomed, Jerusalem remained the point beyond exhaustion, the promise that made retreat feel like spiritual failure. In that sense, Jerusalem was present long before the Crusaders saw it. It marched with them. It lived in their vows, in the crosses sewn to their garments, in the songs and sermons that pushed them forward. It turned geography into judgment. To reach it was to prove endurance, to die before it might still be seen as sacrifice. To abandon the road could feel like abandoning Christ himself. This is why the First Crusade cannot be understood as only a land grab, only a papal project, only a response to Turkish expansion, or only a wave of religious hysteria. It was a convergence, and at the center of that convergence stood a city whose power was not merely political or military, but imaginative. Jerusalem made the distant intimate. It made the impossible feel commanded. And once Europe believed that the road to that city could cleanse the soul, the road itself became holy, no matter how much blood it would carry. Chapter 7. The Promise of Remission. The Crusade did not only ask men to travel, it offered them release. That word matters, because medieval people did not think of sin as a vague feeling of personal regret. Sin was a burden. It had weight. It could cling to a soul, accumulate across a lifetime, and follow a person beyond death into judgment. A man might confess, pray, give alms, endow a monastery, go on pilgrimage, or submit to penance, but the anxiety remained. Had he done enough? Had he repaired what could be repaired? Had he carried too much violence, lust, greed, pride, and cruelty into the ledger of eternity? For warriors, the question was especially sharp. A knight's life was built around force. Even when he fought for his lord, defended his household, or acted according to the customs of his class, he lived close to actions the church regarded as spiritually dangerous. Bloodshed was not easy to wash away. The sword fed his status, but it also threatened his soul. That tension had been growing for generations, and at Clermont, Urban II placed his hand directly upon it. The Crusader was promised remission of sins. We have to be careful here, because modern language can flatten the meaning. This was not a simple permission slip to do anything. It was not, in the minds of churchmen, a magical license for cruelty. The promise was tied to the vow, the journey, the hardship, and the intention of serving a holy cause. A crusader was being invited into a penitential act, one that looked like pilgrimage but demanded military service. Still, whatever distinctions theologians might draw, the emotional force was immense. For the man listening to a preacher, the message could be heard with terrifying simplicity. The violence that once endangered you may now help save you. That was a revolution in moral imagination. Earlier forms of penance often required withdrawal, humility, restitution, fasting, prayer, or pilgrimage. They asked the sinner to turn away from his ordinary patterns. The Crusade did something different. It allowed the warrior to remain a warrior, but to reinterpret his fighting as obedience. It did not demand that the knight abandon the sword. It demanded that he carry it east under the cross. This made crusading unusually powerful because it did not merely accuse the warrior class. It offered them a role. A guilty fighter could become a penitent pilgrim. A man with a violent past could imagine that his body, trained for battle, still had sacred use. Younger sons, indebted lords, hardened soldiers, restless retainers, all could hear in the Crusade a strange promise that their brokenness was not wasted. Even their capacity for violence might be redirected into service. And because the promise touched the soul, it reached deeper than ordinary recruitment. A lord asking for military service could appeal to loyalty. A king could appeal to law. A commander could appeal to pay or honor. But remission spoke to the fear that woke a person in the dark. When titles and armor meant very little, it spoke to the final loneliness of judgment. It suggested that the road east might become a road through guilt. This is why the crusade became more than an army. It became a vow worn on the body. The cross sewn onto clothing was not decoration. It marked a person as committed. To take the cross was to enter a new public identity. Neighbors saw it. Family saw it. Creditors saw it. Rivals saw it. The vow created pressure, honor, expectation, and fear of shame. Once a man had taken the cross, turning back was not merely a practical decision. It could become a spiritual failure in the eyes of others, and perhaps more painfully, in his own. The promise of remission also changed how suffering was understood. Hunger on the road was no longer only hunger. It could become purification. Exhaustion could become penance. The death of companions could be folded into the story of sacrifice. A disastrous march, which in another campaign might look like poor planning or military failure, could be interpreted as a test sent by God. The crusade created a framework in which hardship did not disprove the cause. Hardship could confirm it. This is a dangerous kind of meaning. It can give people endurance beyond reason. It can help them survive. It can also make them ignore warning signs that might otherwise save lives. When suffering is seen as holy, leaders can ask more, followers can bear more, and doubt can begin to feel like betrayal. Yet we should not treat medieval crusaders as fools hypnotized by slogans. Many understood risk. Many knew they might never return. Some made careful arrangements before leaving, selling or mortgaging land, settling disputes, providing for families as best they could. Their choice was not always impulsive. It could be deliberate, painful, and deeply serious. That seriousness is part of what makes the story disturbing. The promise of remission did not work because people were shallow. It worked because they believed the soul mattered more than life. To many modern minds, that is difficult to inhabit. We may understand ambition easily. Greed, fear, social pressure, these feel familiar. But a person risking everything because he believed his eternal fate was at stake can seem almost alien. Still, without that belief, the First Crusade loses its center. The Crusade offered a way to convert movement into penance, danger into devotion, and killing into service. And the most unsettling word there is convert, because the act itself did not become gentle. A sword cut the same whether held by a robber, a vassal, or a pilgrim. Siege warfare remained brutal. Fear remained fear. Bodies still broke. Villages still burned. The transformation happened in meaning. And meaning is not a small thing. Meaning decides what people can live with after the act is done. If a man believes he has murdered for profit, he may be haunted. If he believes he has killed for God, he may kneel in gratitude. That difference can shape civilizations. The promise of remission gave the crusade its inner engine. It allowed men who might otherwise spend their lives caught between violence and guilt to imagine a path through both. It joined the warrior's body to the pilgrim's soul. It made the road east feel not merely possible, but necessary. And once that idea took hold, the old categories began to blur. Was the crusader a soldier or a pilgrim? Was his suffering punishment or purification? Was his enemy a military opponent or an obstacle to salvation? Was Jerusalem a city to be captured or a wound in the Christian imagination that had to be closed? The answer, again and again, depended on belief. And belief, when joined to fear and armed with steel, can make the impossible seem merciful. Chapter 8. The People Who Took the Cross. It is easy to tell the First Crusade as a story of popes and princes. Their names survive more clearly. Their decisions shaped armies. Their quarrels filled chronicles. They owned the banners, gave the orders, negotiated with emperors, and claimed the cities when the fighting was done. But movements this large are never made only from the top. The crusade became real when ordinary and lesser-known people began to answer it in their own lives. By selling a strip of land, leaving a village, pawning a future, sewing a cross onto a cloak, or standing before relatives who knew they might never see that person again. Some were knights, trained to fight and eager for a cause that made their profession feel righteous. Some were great lords, able to bring followers and resources. Some were younger sons with limited inheritance, men whose prospects at home were narrow and whose imaginations may have widened suddenly at the thought of the East. Some were poor, drawn by preaching, fear, devotion, or desperation. Some were clergy. Some were women, traveling with households, families, or religious purpose, though the surviving sources often notice them only when they become inconvenient, vulnerable, or exceptional. And some were simply people who believed. That sounds plain, but it is important. Modern explanations often grow suspicious of belief. We look for economics beneath faith, ambition beneath vows, politics beneath prayer. Those layers are real. They should not be ignored, but neither should they be allowed to erase the possibility that many crusaders sincerely thought they were doing something holy. A man could want forgiveness and land. A woman could fear damnation and fear hunger. A knight could love glory and kneel in genuine tears. Human motives do not arrive in separate containers. They mingle, contradict, and strengthen one another until even the person acting may not be able to name which desire is leading. The crusade was powerful because it did not demand a single motive. It offered different meanings to different people. For the violent, it offered purification. For the indebted, escape or at least delay. For the ambitious, opportunity. For the devout, pilgrimage. For the anxious, a visible act of penance. For the socially trapped, movement. For those who had known only local horizons, it gave the astonishing idea that their lives could touch sacred history. That last point is easy to underestimate. Most people in 11th century Europe lived inside small worlds, a valley, a town, a lordship, a network of markets and churches. These formed the boundaries of ordinary imagination. News traveled, but unevenly. Maps were rare and often symbolic. The East was not simply far away. It was conceptually vast, a region of biblical memory, rumor, danger, wealth, and miracle. To join the crusade was to step beyond the known world into a story that felt larger than the self. There is something deeply human in that. Not innocent, necessarily. Not harmless, but human. People often endure ordinary suffering when they believe it is meaningless, but give suffering a purpose, and they may accept more than anyone would expect. The crusade transformed hardship into evidence of commitment. It gave people a narrative in which leaving home was not abandonment, debt was not failure, danger was not madness, and death might not be defeat. This helps explain why the movement spread beyond the boundaries urban may have intended. A papal appeal could be aimed at warriors, but preaching did not remain politely among the armed elite. It entered churches, roads, marketplaces, households, and imaginations. Once the idea was loose, it belonged to everyone who heard it and remade it in the shape of their own need. A poor man might not grasp Byzantine politics. He did not need to. He could understand that Christ's city mattered. He could understand sin. He could understand the fear that the world was broken and that God might be calling people to repair it. Whether that understanding was accurate in geopolitical terms was almost beside the point. The call worked because it translated enormous historical forces into personal urgency. Take the cross. Leave. Be changed. For knights and nobles, the decision could involve legal and financial complexity. Crusading was expensive. Horses, armor, weapons, servants, supplies, all required resources. Many had to sell, mortgage, or pledge land. Families had to manage estates in their absence. Wives, mothers, brothers, and stewards became part of the Crusade's hidden machinery, holding together the world left behind. This is one of the less dramatic but more revealing sides of the movement. The road to Jerusalem began in notarial agreements, family negotiations, and local compromises as much as in sermons. Behind the romance of departure lay practical anxiety. Who would harvest? Who would repay debts? Who would protect children? Who would inherit if the crusader died somewhere beyond the sea? The cross did not erase these questions. It made them urgent. For poorer participants, the situation could be even more precarious. Some may have joined with little preparation, trusting to charity, momentum, or divine protection. Their presence worried elites, and not without reason. An armed or semi-armed crowd without supplies could become dangerous quickly. Hunger turns piety into pressure. Fear turns rumor into violence. The line between pilgrim band and mob can be thin when there is no food and no clear command. Women's participation also complicates the simple image of the crusade as an all-male military march. The sources do not give us as much as we would like. They were usually written by men, interested mainly in leaders and battles. But women were present in the movement in different ways, as travelers, supporters, patrons, household members, and those who managed estates during absence. Some took vows themselves. Others were pulled into the consequences of vows made by men. Their story is often partly visible, like figures at the edge of a damaged painting. That partial visibility should not make us pretend they were absent. The crusade reorganized families, property, obligations, and grief. Even those who never left Europe lived with its consequences. And then there were the adventurers, the opportunists, the men whose motives chroniclers might dress in noble language, but whose eyes were fixed on advancement. The East promised danger, yes, but also the possibility of lordship. In a crowded, aristocratic world, a distant conquest could look like an opening. Later events would show that some leaders were very capable of seeing holy war and personal gain at the same time. Again, the point is not to choose between faith and ambition. The point is that the crusade made them travel together. This is what gave the movement its strange texture. It was neither purely spiritual nor purely material. It was a pilgrimage with supply problems, an army with penitential vows, a social escape route dressed as obedience, a theater of ambition lit by sacred fire. The people who took the cross were not all the same kind of person. That is precisely why the movement spread. It could speak to the guilty and the hungry, the proud and the frightened, the noble and the obscure. It promised that the road east might turn ordinary lives into instruments of divine purpose. But when thousands of people begin moving under a promise that large, no one can fully govern what they bring with them. Their debts came with them. Their fears came with them. Their prejudices came with them. Their hunger, their rumors, their old violence, their desperate hope. All of it took the cross as well. And soon, before the great princes had even completed their preparations, that human flood would begin to move ahead of them. Chapter 9. The People's Crusade and the First Unleashing. Before the princes were ready, the road began filling with people who were not supposed to lead history. They came in loose bands, with carts, walking staffs, animals, children, scraps of armor, household goods, and expectations far larger than their supplies. Some were armed, many were not. Some had experience of violence. Many had only the heat of a sermon still burning in their ears. They were pilgrims, wanderers, peasants, minor knights, debtors, enthusiasts, and the desperate poor. A movement too sincere to dismiss and too unstable to romanticize. This is the episode often called the People's Crusade. The name itself can mislead. It makes the movement sound unified, as if the people rose together with a single mind. In reality, it was a collection of groups moving under shared religious excitement, but uneven discipline. Its most famous preacher was Peter the Hermit, a figure later tradition would remember with almost legendary force. We should be cautious with some of the stories attached to him, because the memory of the crusade quickly grew larger than the evidence. But what can be said with confidence is that popular preaching helped carry the crusading message beyond noble courts and into the emotional life of ordinary communities. And once there, it changed shape. Urban II had called for an armed pilgrimage, but ideas do not remain under the control of the person who releases them. The promise of remission, the language of sacred rescue, the dream of Jerusalem, these did not wait patiently for aristocratic organization. They entered a Europe already anxious, violent, and devout. They reached people who had little money, little protection, and little understanding of the lands between home and the holy city. For some, the call east was not a strategy. It was an emergency of the soul. That urgency explains much of what followed. People left too soon. They moved without adequate preparation. They assumed or hoped that Christian charity would feed them along the way. In some places, they were received with sympathy. In others, they became a burden. A large crowd traveling through populated regions consumes food, demands passage, strains local patience, and brings the possibility of theft, panic, and retaliation. Piety does not solve logistics. That may be one of the most human lessons of the First Crusade. A vow can move the heart, but it cannot bake bread, shoe horses, organize supply lines, or negotiate safely with every town along the road. The People's Crusade exposed the gap between religious imagination and practical survival. The participants believed they were walking toward salvation, but they still needed grain. They still needed bâton. They still needed leaders capable of keeping fear from turning into violence. Often, they did not have them. As these early crusading bands moved through Europe toward the east, disorder followed. Not everywhere, not in one simple pattern, but enough to reveal how unstable the movement had become. Local tensions could flare. Armed men without pay could become predatory. Crowds that saw themselves as holy could interpret resistance as wickedness. And once hunger entered the story, the line between pilgrimage and coercion thinned. The official crusading armies, led by great nobles, would have their own problems. They would quarrel, starve, negotiate badly, and commit brutal acts. But they at least possessed structures of command, wealth, military experience, and political purpose. The People's Crusade had fervor first and organization second. That order of priorities was disastrous. Its journey toward Constantinople became a warning that few understood quickly enough. For Emperor Alexios, the arrival of these early bands must have been deeply alarming. He had asked for military assistance, soldiers who could serve imperial strategy. What appeared instead were huge, undisciplined crowds, difficult to supply and impossible to fully trust. The emperor's problem was immediate: how to move them out of the capital's orbit before they damaged his lands or provoked wider chaos. So they were carried across into Asia Minor. There, the crusading dream met the hard geography of war. The People's Crusade was shattered by Turkish forces in 1096. Many were killed or captured. The Holy Road, which had seemed so open in preaching, became a place of confusion and death. The movement had set out with the confidence of divine favor, yet faith did not protect it from ambush, poor planning, or military reality. This collapse matters because it shows something essential about the First Crusade before the better-known armies even reached the East. Religious conviction could generate astonishing motion, but it could not guarantee wisdom. It could sanctify courage, but not discipline. It could give suffering meaning, but it could also lead people into suffering they were not equipped to survive. And there was another, darker lesson. The Crusade's first unleashing did not fall only on distant enemies. It also turned against people much closer to home. Before many crusaders ever saw Muslim lands, some had already begun to ask a terrible question. If they were marching to fight the enemies of Christ far away, what of those they had long been taught to view with suspicion nearby? That question would become lethal. The People's Crusade revealed how quickly sacred certainty could slide into violence without clear boundaries. Preaching had named enemies in the East, but crowds carried their own fears and hatreds. They carried old local resentments, religious prejudice, debt, rumor, and the need to prove zeal. When a movement tells people that history has split into the servants of God and the enemies of God, some will begin looking for enemies before the road has even properly begun. This is not an argument that the People's Crusade was uniquely monstrous. It was, in many ways, a tragic mixture of devotion and desperation. Many participants likely believed they were answering God's call. Many suffered terribly. Many died far from home, having gained nothing but hardship. But sincerity does not make a movement harmless. In fact, sincerity can make it more dangerous when it strips away ordinary hesitation. A cynical soldier may pause if the reward is not worth the risk. A true believer may not. The People's Crusade, therefore, stands at the edge of the whole story like a warning carved into the road. It shows the crusade before noble banners and famous sieges, before Antioch and Jerusalem, before victory gave chroniclers a structure to impose on the chaos. Here, at the beginning, the movement appears raw, hungry, emotional, disorganized, convinced, vulnerable, and violent. It was not yet the army that would capture Jerusalem. It was the first proof that the idea had escaped control. And once an idea like that begins moving through frightened people, it does not ask permission before choosing its victims. Chapter 10. The shadow falls on Europe's Jews. Before the Crusaders reached the east, before the walls of Antioch, before Jerusalem became a battlefield, the Holy War had already found victims in Europe. They were not Turkish soldiers. They were not rulers blocking the road. They were Jewish communities living along the Rhine. This is one of the darkest turns in the story, and it cannot be treated as a side note. The massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland in 1096 reveal something the crusading idea could become when religious certainty, debt, fear, and mob violence fused together close to home. The road to Jerusalem had not yet left Christian Europe, and already the language of sacred war had begun turning inward. Jewish communities had lived in parts of Western Europe for generations. They were minorities, often vulnerable, sometimes protected by rulers or bishops, sometimes tolerated because they filled important social and economic roles, and often surrounded by suspicion sharpened by Christian teaching. Medieval Christian attitudes toward Jews were complex, but they were frequently hostile. Jews were seen not simply as religious outsiders, but through a theological lens that blamed them for rejecting Christ. That accusation, repeated across centuries, created a dangerous emotional reservoir. The crusade drew from it. For some crusaders, a grim logic began to form. Why travel hundreds of miles to fight enemies of Christ in the East while Jews lived nearby? It was a false and murderous logic, but once spoken inside a movement already charged with apocalyptic hope and penitential urgency, it could become persuasive to those looking for a target. The enemy did not have to be understood clearly. He only had to be named, and naming is often the first violence. The Rhineland massacres were not one single event. They unfolded in several communities, including places such as Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, with varying circumstances and responses from local authorities. Some bishops and rulers tried to protect Jewish communities. Sometimes protection held. Sometimes it failed. Sometimes the attackers were crusading bands. Sometimes local forces joined or exploited the violence. The evidence comes from both Christian and Jewish sources, and while details differ, the larger pattern is painfully clear. Jewish men, women, and children were attacked, killed, or forced into impossible choices under pressure of conversion and death. We should speak carefully here. The horror does not need embroidery. It is enough. The victims were people with households, debts, prayers, arguments, children, memories, and names that history has only partly preserved. They were not symbols in someone else's spiritual drama. Yet that is exactly how persecutors treated them. The crusading imagination could reduce living neighbors into theological obstacles, as if violence against them somehow proved devotion. This is where holy war shows one of its most dangerous features. It does not only authorize violence against a distant enemy, it can reorganize the moral map at home. Once people believe they are acting inside a divine emergency, ordinary restraints weaken. Old resentments become sacred duties. Greed can disguise itself as zeal. Theft can walk behind a cross. Murder can be framed as purification. That does not mean every crusader participated in the massacres. They did not. It does not mean Urban II explicitly commanded violence against Jews. The evidence does not support that. Church authorities often condemned or resisted such attacks, at least in principle. But movements are judged not only by official intentions. They must also be judged by the energies they release and the boundaries they fail to hold. The Crusade released energies that some leaders could not control. The Rhineland violence also exposes a practical undercurrent that should not be ignored. Money. Many crusaders needed funds. Some were in debt. Jewish lenders, because of the economic roles forced or permitted under medieval conditions, could become targets not only of religious hatred, but of financial resentment. To kill or drive out accreditors could be made to look, in the attacker's mind, like both piety and convenience. That mixture is especially poisonous. When sacred language gives cover to material interest, people can commit crimes while telling themselves they have made a sacrifice. Here, the Crusade's promise of purification became grotesquely inverted. Men who claimed to be cleansing their souls stained the road before even leaving Europe. There is a painful contradiction in the chronicles of this moment. Some Christian accounts are uneasy. Some try to distance the official crusade from the violence. Jewish accounts, written from within the wound, preserve the terror, courage, grief, and religious anguish of communities facing annihilation. They show families and leaders trying to understand why neighbors had turned against them under the sign of a movement claiming holiness. The evidence is not always simple, and the numbers can be debated, but the moral shape is not obscure. The massacres were atrocities. They also marked a turning point in European Jewish history. Anti-Jewish violence had existed before 1096, but the crusading movement gave it a new intensity and a new framework. The idea of holy violence, once unleashed, did not stay pointed east. It taught some Christians to imagine religious difference within Europe as a threat to be attacked rather than a reality to be governed, debated, or tolerated. This legacy would echo long after the First Crusade. That is why this chapter of the story matters so much. Without the Rhineland massacres, the First Crusade can too easily be told as a dramatic expedition outward. Europe marching to Byzantium, Anatolia, Antioch, Jerusalem. But the violence against Jews reveals that crusading was also an inward crisis. It exposed what could happen when a society already shaped by religious hierarchy and prejudice was given a language of sacred urgency. The enemy could be found anywhere, and if the enemy could be found anywhere, then no minority was entirely safe. There is another uncomfortable point. The massacres were not accidents in the sense of being meaningless. They grew from existing beliefs, existing social tensions, and the Crusade's own logic of sanctified violence. They were not simply random chaos along the road. They were what happens when a movement promises spiritual clarity to people living inside fear, resentment, and inequality. Clarity can be merciless. The Crusaders who attacked Jewish communities may have believed they were beginning the war early, purifying Christian lands before heading east. That belief does not explain away the crime. It reveals how the crime became possible. Once the world is divided into holy cause and sacred enemy, the human face of the neighbor can disappear with terrifying speed. And that disappearance is one of the oldest warnings in history. By the time the official armies moved toward Constantinople, the crusade had already shown two faces. One was the face it gave itself: pilgrimage, penance, rescue, the road to Jerusalem. The other was visible in the Rhineland: coercion, massacre, religious hatred, and the conversion of local prejudice into sacred violence. Both belonged to the same age. Both would travel forward. And in the shadow of those ruined communities, the central question of the First Crusade becomes harder to avoid. When people believe God has blessed their violence, who is left outside its reach? Chapter 11. Princes on the road to the east. When the official armies finally began to move, the crusade changed shape. The first wave had been raw enthusiasm, unstable, poorly supplied, carried forward by preaching and panic as much as planning. Now came the great lords, the men with names that chroniclers could follow more easily. Men whose banners gathered vassals, knights, servants, horses, money, and political consequence. They did not come as one army. That is important. The First Crusade was never a single machine under a single commander. It was a coalition of armed pilgrim forces, stitched together by vows, sermons, shared purpose, and uneasy necessity. Its leaders had taken the cross, but they had not stopped being rivals, aristocrats, negotiators, and men accustomed to defending their own honor. They could kneel for the same cause and still distrust each other across the campfire. Among them was Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most senior nobles to join the expedition. He brought prestige, resources, and a sense of gravity. His age and status gave him weight, and he seems to have imagined himself as a natural leader of the movement. Though natural leadership in a crusading army was never quite natural enough to be accepted by everyone. There was Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, sharp, ambitious, and experienced in war. His background mattered. The Normans of southern Italy had a long and difficult relationship with Byzantium. They had fought the empire before, so when Bohemond rode east under the cross, Emperor Alexios had every reason to watch him carefully. A man could call himself a pilgrim and still remember old ambitions. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, later remembered with a kind of solemn legend because of his role after Jerusalem. But at the beginning, he was one noble among others, bringing forces from the lands of Lotharingia, bound by oath, family, and expectation. His later reputation can make him seem inevitable, as though history had already chosen him. It had not. The crusade was full of men whose futures were uncertain, and whose decisions could have gone another way. There were others too: Robert of Normandy, Stephen of Blois, Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Flanders, Tancred, and many lesser lords whose names flicker in the sources and then disappear behind larger events. Each brought followers. Each brought obligations. Each brought a personal world of debts, kinship, pride, reputation, and calculation. The official crusade, then, was not just a religious movement. It was a traveling aristocratic society under extreme pressure. That pressure would reveal everything. A nobleman going on crusade did not leave his identity behind at the edge of Europe. He carried it with him. His followers expected reward, food, protection, and honor. His peers watched how he behaved. His enemies remembered weakness. His family's reputation could rise or collapse on the road. Even in a holy expedition, aristocratic politics did not politely vanish. They adapted. This is why the crusading vow is so fascinating. It created a shared spiritual purpose. but it did not erase the social habits of the men who took it. These leaders were pilgrims, yes. They were also warlords. They were penitents, but also competitors. They could believe sincerely in the liberation of Jerusalem, while still bargaining fiercely over cities, supplies, and command. The result was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was medieval reality. Faith and ambition were not always enemies. Sometimes they cooperated beautifully, which is exactly what makes them dangerous. Bohemond could see opportunity in Antioch and still speak the language of holy war. Raymond could insist on devotion while also guarding his prestige. Godfrey could seek salvation and still act within the expectations of noble power. To demand that crusaders be either pure believers or cynical opportunists is to ask history to become simpler than human beings are. The road east also forced these princes into contact with another authority, Byzantium. This was delicate from the start. The crusaders needed the empire. They needed passage, markets, guides, shipping, intelligence, and political access to lands they did not understand. But needing someone does not always produce gratitude. Sometimes it produces resentment. The Western nobles came with armed followers and sacred vows. They did not necessarily enjoy being treated as useful but dangerous guests by an emperor whose court operated according to different rules. Alexios, for his part, had every reason to demand oaths from them. He wanted lands recovered from Turkish control to be returned to Byzantine authority. From his perspective, this was reasonable. Many of those lands had belonged to the empire before recent losses. The Crusaders had come, at least originally, in response to his plea for aid. Why should conquests made with imperial assistance become private Western prizes? But from the Crusaders' perspective, the issue could look different. They were not mercenaries in the ordinary sense. They had sold land, crossed great distances, endured danger, and taken vows before God. If they captured a city after months of misery, should it simply be handed over to a distant emperor whom many distrusted? Was the crusade an imperial recovery campaign or a divine expedition? The answer depended on who was speaking and who held the walls. This tension would become one of the defining cracks in the entire enterprise. The crusade needed unity, but its leaders had no single political vision. Some were more willing to cooperate with Byzantium. Some were suspicious. Some saw the empire as an ally. Others saw it as a rich and slippery power that might use them and then abandon them. The differences were not trivial. They shaped the fate of cities and the bitterness of later memory. Still, for all their rivalry, the princes had one great advantage over the popular bands that went before them. They knew how to wage war. They understood command, siegecraft, discipline, negotiation, and the grim arithmetic of supplies. Not perfectly. The official crusade would suffer terribly from hunger, disease, bad decisions, and internal conflict. But these armies were not merely crowds with crosses. They possessed military structures capable of surviving disaster long enough to turn it into legend. That survival should not be mistaken for smooth progress. A crusading army was a restless organism. It contained elite cavalry, infantry, non-combatants, clergy, servants, animals, carts, and camp followers. It moved slowly. It needed enormous quantities of food. It depended on local markets and sometimes on plunder. It was bound together by belief. But belief did not prevent quarrels over route, leadership, or spoils. Every mile east made the question sharper: who was in charge? The Pope had inspired the movement, But he was not leading the army in person. The emperor demanded cooperation, but Western princes were not his subjects. No king commanded the whole expedition. The leaders could consult, argue, threaten, persuade, and occasionally act together. But unity had to be remade again and again, usually under stress. This makes the success of the First Crusade almost more surprising than its brutality. It was an army of competing ambitions, crossing unfamiliar lands, dependent on fragile alliances, carrying a spiritual promise no commander could fully administer. It should have broken apart many times. In fact, it nearly did. Its leaders mistrusted each other. Its followers suffered. Its purpose was exalted, but its daily needs were painfully ordinary. Yet the shared vow kept pulling them forward, not always nobly, not always peacefully, but persistently. The princes on the road to the east were not saints carved into cathedral stone. They were political men moving through a religious storm. They had enough faith to endure hardship, enough ambition to seize opportunity, enough pride to quarrel over honor, and enough military skill to make their movement dangerous to everyone in its path. They would soon arrive before Constantinople, where the shining capital of Eastern Christendom waited behind its walls. And there, the crusade would face a problem no sermon had solved. Christians who needed each other, feared each other, and were already preparing to disagree about the meaning of victory. Chapter 12. Constantinople. Allies who did not trust each other. When the Crusaders reached Constantinople, they arrived at the edge of another Christian imagination. The city was not merely large, it was overwhelming. For men who had known the smaller towns, castles, and cathedral cities of Western Europe, Constantinople could feel like a different order of reality. Its walls stretched with imperial confidence. Its markets carried goods from worlds the Crusaders barely understood. Its ceremonies moved according to rhythms older and more polished than anything in the West. Here was a Christian capital that did not need to imitate Rome because, in its own mind, it still was Rome. And into this city came the armed pilgrims. They had crossed Europe under vows. They had left estates, debts, families, and graves behind them. They believed themselves servants of a holy cause. Yet to the Byzantines watching them approach, they must have looked like something more complicated. Useful, dangerous, hungry, and possibly impossible to control. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had asked for help, but he had not asked for this. He wanted military assistance that could strengthen imperial aims, especially the recovery of territory in Asia Minor. What he received was a procession of Western princes, each with followers, ambitions, and a sacred mission that did not fit neatly into Byzantine policy. Alexios was an experienced ruler. He understood power well enough to know that allies can become threats simply by arriving in large numbers. So he did what emperors do when danger cannot be refused. He tried to manage it. The central issue was the oath. Alexios wanted the crusading leaders to promise that lands formerly belonging to the Byzantine Empire, if recovered, would be returned to him. In his world, this was not greed. It was restoration. These territories had been part of the imperial sphere before Turkish advances and internal disorder had shaken Byzantine control. If Western forces were entering the east, partly in response to his appeal, then their victories should serve imperial recovery. From the Crusaders' side, the matter was more delicate. They had not crossed half the known world to become ordinary hired soldiers. They had taken the cross, not imperial wages. They believed their suffering belonged to God, not simply to Alexios. Many had paid dearly to come, and every mile made their commitment harder to reduce to someone else's strategy. They needed the emperor's help, but they did not necessarily accept his claim over the future. That is the tension beneath the glitter of Constantinople. Two Christian worlds using the same sacred language while meaning different things by it. The Byzantines saw order through empire. The Western Crusaders saw purpose through vow, honor, and armed pilgrimage. Alexios thought in terms of diplomacy, recovered provinces, and controlled force. The Crusaders thought in terms of penance, Jerusalem, reputation, and divine favor. Neither side was irrational. Neither side was innocent. Both sides had reasons to be wary, and suspicion has a way of producing the evidence it expects. Western chroniclers often portrayed the Byzantines as slippery, overly clever, luxurious, or untrustworthy. Byzantine observers could view Westerners as rough, violent, arrogant, and dangerously undisciplined. These impressions were not neutral descriptions. They were cultural defenses. Each side explained the other in ways that protected its own pride. The Crusaders could resent Byzantine caution as cowardice or treachery. The Byzantines could interpret Crusader boldness as barbarism dressed in piety. Both were partly wrong. Both were sometimes partly right. This is why Constantinople matters so much in the First Crusade. It was not only a stop on the route. It was the place where the Crusade's contradictions became diplomatic fact. The Crusaders needed Byzantine food, ships, guides, and political knowledge. Alexios needed their military power, but not their independence. Everyone spoke of Christian unity, yet unity had to pass through negotiations, oaths, delays, ceremonies, and guarded hospitality. There is a quiet absurdity here, almost human enough to be comic if the stakes were not so high. Men had vowed to march to Jerusalem for the sake of Christendom, and first they had to argue with other Christians about paperwork, authority, and who would own cities not yet captured. But that is how history usually works. The grand cause meets the legal clause. Some leaders accepted the emperor's demands more readily than others. Some resisted. Bohemond of Taranto, with his Norman background and his people's history of conflict with Byzantium, was especially watched. Alexios would have understood that Bohemond was not simply a pilgrim with a sword. He was a man with memory, talent, and appetite. Raymond of Toulouse, too, had his own prestige and his own sense of mission. Godfrey and the others had to weigh practical need against aristocratic pride. The oaths did not create trust. They created a temporary bridge over mistrust. That distinction matters. An oath can bind behavior, but it cannot make hearts transparent. The Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor with promises behind them and suspicions beside them. Alexios could hope that imperial claims had been secured. The princes could tell themselves that cooperation was necessary for now. But everyone knew future victories would test the meaning of what had been sworn, and the future would test it harshly. The meeting at Constantinople also exposed a deeper division within Christendom itself. Eastern and Western Christians shared core beliefs, scriptures, and sacred history. But their worlds had grown apart in language, liturgy, politics, and temperament. The formal break between Rome and Constantinople had already occurred earlier in the century, but the lived relationship was more complicated than a clean rupture. There was rivalry, misunderstanding, occasional cooperation, and a sense on both sides that the other had drifted from proper order. The Crusade did not heal that division. It placed an army inside it. Urban II may have imagined the expedition as a way to strengthen Christian unity, perhaps even to improve relations with the East. In theory, the defense of Eastern Christians could bind Latin and Greek Christendom together. In practice, the encounter revealed how fragile that hope was. A shared enemy did not erase different ambitions. A shared cross did not create a shared command. For ordinary crusaders, Constantinople must have been bewildering. They saw wealth at a scale that could inspire awe and resentment at the same time. They were dependent on a Christian emperor they did not fully trust. They were close to the lands where their holy labor would begin, yet still caught in negotiations that made the great mission feel strangely worldly. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail. The crusade never stopped being worldly. Not even at its most spiritual. Its vows were real. Its prayers were real. Its longing for Jerusalem was real. But it moved through money, ships, markets, imperial policy, aristocratic rivalry, and cultural suspicion. To understand the First Crusade, we cannot separate these layers. The sacred did not float above politics. It traveled through politics, argued with it, depended on it, and sometimes used it as a mask. At Constantinople, the Crusaders and Byzantines stood face to face as allies who feared what alliance might cost them. Alexios looked at the Western armies and saw both rescue and risk. The Crusaders looked at the emperor and saw both helper and obstacle. Each needed the other to cross the next threshold. Neither fully trusted the hand extended, so the oaths were sworn. The arrangements were made. The armies moved onward, and behind them, in the imperial city, there remained the uneasy knowledge that even victory might become a dispute. Chapter 13. Hunger, Siege, and the Making of a Holy Army. Once the Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor, the crusade became less an idea and more a test of bodies. The sermons were behind them now. The arguments at Constantinople were behind them. Ahead lay heat, distance, unfamiliar roads, hostile forces, and the slow discovery that holy purpose did not make a campaign any easier to supply. The first great objective was Nicaea. For the Byzantines, Nicaea mattered because it stood dangerously close to Constantinople, a major city held by Turkish power within striking distance of the imperial capital. For the Crusaders, it was the first serious proof that their expedition could do more than survive. It could take cities. It could cooperate, however awkwardly, with the empire. It could turn the vow into conquest. But even here, victory carried tension. The siege of Nicaea in 1097 ended with the city surrendering to Byzantine forces rather than being stormed and plundered by the Crusaders. From Alexios's perspective, this was sensible and successful. A former imperial city was recovered without unnecessary destruction. From the Crusaders' perspective, or at least from the perspective of many disappointed fighters, it could feel like being denied the rewards of their labor. This was an early lesson in alliance. Two sides can celebrate the same victory for entirely different reasons. The Crusaders had helped win Nicaea, but the city did not become theirs. The oath to Alexios had meaning. Byzantine policy had teeth, and somewhere in the camps, resentment likely deepened. The Crusaders still needed the empire, but they were beginning to learn that imperial cooperation came with limits. The Byzantines were not simply guides on the road to Jerusalem. They had their own map, their own priorities, and their own claim on the future. Then came the march across Anatolia. This was where the crusade began to harden. The land itself became an enemy, not in some poetic sense, but in the practical and merciless way that distance destroys armies. The Crusaders had to move people, horses, pack animals, weapons, armor, carts, and supplies across difficult terrain under pressure from Turkish forces. Water mattered. Grass mattered. Local markets mattered. A dead horse could change a knight into a foot soldier. A lost pack animal could mean hunger. A broken line of march could become panic. The Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097 showed both the danger and resilience of the crusading army. Turkish forces attacked part of the Crusader host, and for a time the situation was desperate. The Crusaders were vulnerable, stretched, and under assault by mounted archers whose style of warfare many Westerners were still learning to face. But other crusading forces arrived, and the battle turned. What might have become disaster became victory. To the Crusaders, this was not only tactics, it was interpretation. A modern military historian may speak of reinforcements, formations, timing, and battlefield adaptation. Those things matter. But the Crusaders also lived in a world where survival demanded meaning. If they escaped destruction, it was natural for them to see the hand of God. If the army endured thirst, hunger, ambush, and exhaustion, then endurance itself could become evidence that the mission was protected. This is one of the ways a holy army is made, not simply by preaching, by suffering together, and then explaining that suffering together. The march did not make the Crusaders gentler. It made them more convinced. Every hardship could be woven into the sacred story. Heat became trial. Hunger became purification. Fear became proof that the enemy was real. Survival became miracle. The dead became sacrifices along the road. The living carried not only weapons, but the memory of having been tested. And the testing was severe. Anatolia exposed the Crusades' dependence on things far less glorious than faith. Waterskins, forage, local guides, grain, pack animals, the timing of movement, the discipline to keep marching when the body wanted to stop. Medieval warfare was not only decided in charges and sieges, it was decided in stomachs, hooves, and the ability to keep thousands of people from dissolving into scattered hunger. This is where the crusade becomes less like a shining procession and more like a moving wound. People fell behind. Animals died. Armor that had symbolized status became a burden under the sun. The road stripped away illusions. A knight who had imagined Jerusalem in prayer now had to think about where his horse would drink. A pilgrim who had taken the cross for salvation now had to survive the next day's march. And yet, the army continued. That persistence mattered as much as any victory. The Crusaders were learning how to become a community under pressure, not a peaceful community, not a unified one. Their leaders still argued. Their followers still suffered. The old rivalries did not disappear, but the shared experience of danger gave the movement a new internal force. They had crossed from promise into ordeal, and ordeal created identity. The farther they traveled, the more return became unthinkable. This was partly practical. The distance home grew greater. Resources were spent. Property had been sold or pledged. Honor had been publicly committed. But it was also spiritual. To turn back after so much suffering would not merely mean abandoning a campaign. It might mean admitting that the suffering had no sacred purpose. For many, that would have been unbearable. So the road itself became a kind of argument. Every grave behind them insisted that the journey must mean something. The Crusaders also encountered Christian communities of the East, including Armenians and others whose relationship to both Byzantium and the Latin Crusaders could be complex. These encounters did not form one simple story of unity. Local politics mattered. Different Christian traditions carried different loyalties and grievances. Still, for Crusaders, the presence of Eastern Christians could reinforce the idea that they were entering a wounded Christian landscape, a place where their mission had visible human stakes. At the same time, the crusading army was becoming increasingly dangerous to the lands it crossed. Hungry armies rarely remain harmless. Even when leaders tried to negotiate supplies, pressure could turn into seizure. The line between purchase and plunder could blur. A movement that understood itself as sacred still had to eat, and when food ran short, theology did not prevent coercion. This is one of the recurring contradictions of the Crusade. Its participants often interpreted hardship as holy, but others experienced that hardship as invasion. A crusader's desperate search for grain could become a villager's ruin. A camp's need for animals could become a local family's loss. The army's survival required resources, and resources came from somewhere. The making of a holy army was also the making of a burden on everyone around it. By the time the Crusaders pushed deeper into the East, they had changed. They were not the same people who had first taken vows in Europe. The weak had suffered. The impatient had been tested. The leaders had learned both the value and difficulty of cooperation. The ordinary followers had seen that the road to Jerusalem was not a clean path laid open by heaven, but a brutal passage through thirst, fear, and death. And because they had endured it, many believed more strongly, not less. This is difficult, but essential to understand. Hardship does not always weaken belief. Often, it deepens it. The more a person pays for an idea, the harder it becomes to release. The Crusaders had paid in money, comfort, blood, and distance. To doubt the crusade now would mean doubting not only Urban's sermon, but their own sacrifices. So they pressed forward, past Nicaea, past the terror of Dorylaeum, across the punishing roads of Anatolia. Their army was thinner, harsher, more experienced, and more dependent than ever on the belief that God had not brought them this far for nothing. Ahead waited Antioch, and before its walls, that belief would be brought closer to breaking than anyone had yet imagined. Chapter 14. Antioch and the Edge of Collapse. Antioch was not just another city on the road. It was a wall between the Crusaders and the future they had promised themselves. By the time they reached it in late 1097, the army had already been remade by hunger, distance, and fear. But Antioch demanded something different. It did not ask them to win a battle and move on. It required patience. It required supply. It required unity. It required the very qualities crusading armies found hardest to maintain. The city was enormous, ancient, and difficult to take. Its walls ran across rugged ground and climbed toward the mountain slopes, making a complete encirclement nearly impossible for the Crusaders at first. Inside were defenders with stores, position, and time. Outside were men who had marched too far to turn back, but who did not have enough food to wait comfortably. Sieges are often described as military events, but they are also psychological prisons. The besieger thinks he is trapping the city. Very often, he is trapping himself. At Antioch, the Crusaders settled into a long ordeal. Food became scarce. Prices rose. Horses weakened or died. Men who had once imagined themselves riding gloriously to Jerusalem now faced the dull humiliation of starvation. A knight without a horse was not only less useful in battle, he was symbolically diminished. His status had legs, and those legs were dying in the camp. The crusade had promised spiritual meaning, but it still ran on grain. As weeks stretched into months, the army's unity frayed. Some deserted. Others searched for supplies. Leaders argued. The ordinary followers watched their bodies shrink and their hopes tighten around rumor. The distance from Europe now mattered in a new way. Home was not simply far away. It was nearly unreachable. Too much had been spent. Too many vows made. Too many dead left behind. Antioch became the place where retreat felt impossible and victory felt increasingly unlikely. That is the kind of pressure under which visions begin to matter. In a starving army, the boundary between faith, fear, and imagination can become thin. Dreams are not harmless decorations in such a world. They can guide decisions, restore courage, accuse the doubtful, and bind a collapsing community together. The Crusaders did not interpret visions as private curiosities. They could become public evidence, signs that heaven had not abandoned the expedition. We should approach these reports carefully. Medieval chronicles often record visions, omens, and miraculous signs, but they do so through the assumptions of their age and through the needs of storytelling. Some visions may reflect genuine religious experience. Some may have been shaped by memory after the fact. Some may have been politically useful. What matters is not whether every account can be verified in modern terms, but that the Crusaders themselves lived in a world where such signs could change behavior. At Antioch, signs were needed because despair was becoming practical. The city eventually fell in June 1098, not through a simple assault, but through betrayal from within. A gate tower was opened to the Crusaders by an insider, often identified in the sources as Firuz, allowing them to enter. It was a moment of astonishing reversal. After months of misery, the impossible city was suddenly theirs. But the victory was almost cruel in its timing, because no sooner had the Crusaders taken Antioch than they became the besieged. A large Muslim relief army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived, and the Crusaders found themselves trapped inside the city they had barely captured. They were exhausted. They were hungry. They had lost many horses. Supplies were still desperate. The walls that had kept them out now kept them in, and the crusading army stood at the edge of ruin. This is one of the most revealing moments in the entire expedition. If the crusade had collapsed at Antioch, the story would look very different. Clermont would be remembered as a sermon that sent thousands to disaster. The road to Jerusalem would have ended in a starving failure inside a captured city. The language of divine favor would have required a much darker explanation. But the army did not collapse. Instead, under pressure so intense that ordinary morale might have broken completely, the Crusaders found renewed meaning in one of the most famous and disputed episodes of the First Crusade, the discovery of the Holy Lance. A Provençal visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed that the lance that pierced Christ's side was buried in Antioch. After digging in the Cathedral of St. Peter, a relic was produced. Some believed. Some doubted. The evidence was contested even then. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate and one of the more respected spiritual figures in the army, appears to have been skeptical. Others saw the discovery as exactly the sign the starving army needed. The historical question is not easily settled. Was it a sincere discovery? A desperate mistake? A staged relic? A symbol made powerful by the army's need to believe? The evidence is thinner than faith would like and more complicated than cynicism would prefer. But its effect was real. The Holy Lance gave the Crusaders a way to narrate their survival, before survival had actually been secured. It told them that Christ had not abandoned them in Antioch. It turned starvation into a test and imminent battle into a moment of divine judgment. In a practical sense, the relic helped restore morale. In a spiritual sense, it allowed the army to imagine itself not as trapped prey, but as a chosen people being prepared for deliverance. That kind of belief can change the outcome of events. Not by magic, by making frightened men stand when they might otherwise run. The Crusaders marched out against Kerboga's forces in late June 1098. Their condition was poor, but Kerboga's coalition had its own weaknesses. Muslim political unity was not simple. Rivalries and mistrust affected the relief army. The Crusaders, desperate and newly strengthened by religious conviction, fought with the intensity of people who had reached the end of all alternatives. They won. To them, the victory could only have seemed miraculous, and perhaps that interpretation mattered more than the battle itself. Antioch became proof that God tested his army but did not abandon it. Proof that suffering had meaning. Proof that visions could speak truth. Proof that the road to Jerusalem remained open because heaven wanted it open. Modern analysis can point to military factors, disunity among their enemies, leadership decisions, and battlefield conditions. It should. But to stop there would miss what Antioch did inside the crusading imagination. It gave the army a story of death and resurrection. They had starved outside the walls, broken into the city, been trapped inside, found a relic of Christ's passion, and emerged victorious against what seemed impossible odds. For people living in a sacred universe, that sequence was not coincidence. It was confirmation. Yet Antioch also revealed the old ambitions still alive beneath the holy language. Bohemond of Taranto claimed the city for himself, arguing that Byzantine promises had been compromised and that he had played a decisive role in its capture. Others disputed the matter. The oath to Alexios returned like an unpaid debt. Was Antioch to be restored to Byzantium as sworn? Or had Byzantine failure and Crusader suffering changed the rules? Here the spiritual army became political again. It had never stopped being political. The capture of Antioch gave the crusade new confidence, but it also deepened division. Bohemon's claim showed that conquest under the cross could create lordship, not just liberation. The road to Jerusalem was still ahead, yet already the fruits of victory were being measured, guarded, and argued over. That is the pattern of the crusade in miniature. Faith lifting men beyond endurance, and ambition waiting at the city gate. Antioch nearly destroyed the expedition. Instead, it hardened it. Those who survived had passed through starvation, doubt, disputed miracle, betrayal, siege, and battle. They emerged fewer in number, more suspicious, more experienced, and more certain that their suffering had been chosen for them. This certainty would carry them forward, but it would also make them more dangerous. Because after Antioch, the Crusaders did not merely believe they were going to Jerusalem. They believed they had been preserved for it. Chapter 15, The Road to Jerusalem. After Antioch, the crusade moved with the weight of survivors. The army that turned south was not the same force that had left Europe. It had been thinned by hunger, disease, desertion, battle, and the long, grinding machinery of distance. Many who had taken the cross would never see the holy city. Many horses were gone. Supplies remained uncertain. The leaders still argued. The vow still pulled. That is the strange power of this stage of the story. The Crusaders were weaker in almost every practical sense, yet stronger in the meaning they gave to their survival. Antioch had nearly consumed them. Instead, they had taken the city, endured a second siege, and won a victory they interpreted as divine favor. For those still marching, that memory became a form of fuel. They had not survived because they were lucky. They believed they had survived because they were meant to arrive. The road from Antioch to Jerusalem was not simply a military route. It was the narrowing of a vision. For years, Jerusalem had lived in sermons and imagination, in vows made before neighbors, in crosses sewn to garments, in debts settled before departure, in the final words of those who died along the way. Now the city was no longer only a sacred idea. It was becoming a place with distance, roads, heat, walls, and defenders. The transition matters. An imagined Jerusalem could be perfect. A real Jerusalem would have to be conquered. The Crusaders moved through a political landscape more complicated than the simple language of holy war allowed. The Muslim world was not united against them in one seamless front. Local rulers had their own rivalries, calculations, and fears. Some negotiated, some resisted, some watched. The Crusaders themselves, though bound by religious purpose, were hardly unified in every decision. Their leaders had to balance urgency, fatigue, ambition, and the terrifying awareness that the great goal was now close enough to expose failure completely. Because the closer Jerusalem came, the harder failure would be to bear. A defeat in Anatolia could be explained as trial. Starvation at Antioch could be endured as purification. But to come within reach of Jerusalem and fail, that would wound the entire meaning of the expedition. It would raise questions no one wanted to ask aloud. Had they misunderstood God's will? Had their sins made them unworthy? Had the dead suffered for nothing? So the army pressed on, carrying not only weapons, but the burden of interpretation. There were delays and disputes, as there always were. The Crusades' leaders did not suddenly become selfless because the holy city was near. Bohemond remained in Antioch, holding the prize he had claimed. Others continued south. Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Tancred, and the remaining leaders had to move forward with an army still capable of force, but no longer abundant in strength. This reduced condition gave the final march a different atmosphere. The crusade had begun as a swelling movement, too large for any single authority to contain. Now it was a hardened remnant. The people still on the road had been selected by ordeal. They had seen companions vanish into graves, captivity, sickness, and hunger. They had watched confidence break and return. Their faith had become less like enthusiasm and more like scar tissue. There is a difference between fresh zeal and exhausted conviction. Fresh zeal sings easily. Exhausted conviction marches because turning back would make everything meaningless. That is what Jerusalem meant by this point. It was no longer only the city of Christ. It was the answer the Crusaders needed history to give them. Every suffering demanded it. Every vow leaned toward it. Every rumor of the city tightened the emotional pressure inside the army. And then, in June 1099, they saw it. The sources describe crusaders reacting with intense emotion when Jerusalem came into view. We should allow some space for literary shaping, because chroniclers knew what such a moment ought to mean. Still, it is not difficult to believe that men and women who had crossed so much would weep, kneel, pray, or stand in stunned silence before the place they had carried in their minds for years. For a moment, imagination and geography met, but the meeting was not peaceful. Jerusalem stood before them not as a vision, but as a fortified city. The Crusaders were exhausted. They lacked adequate water. They lacked enough siege equipment at first. The summer heat pressed against men already worn down by years of campaigning. And the city's defenders were not symbols. They were human beings preparing for assault. This is where the story tightens into its hardest contradiction. The Crusaders approached Jerusalem as pilgrims. They would have understood themselves as penitents arriving at the center of the Christian world. Yet the only way into the city was by siege. Prayer would gather around ladders. Fasting would stand beside axes. Sacred longing would become military engineering. The road to redemption had ended at a wall. That wall forced the Crusaders to become practical again. They needed timber for siege towers, ladders, tools, water, coordination, and timing. The final approach to Jerusalem was not a clean spiritual ascent. It was labor. Men cut, hauled, built, sweated, argued, and prepared to kill. The heavenly city of the imagination required very earthly carpentry. There is something almost unbearable in that contrast, but it is also revealing. The First Crusade was never able to escape the material world. Its highest hopes depended on food, wood, iron, water, and exhausted bodies. The sacred was not separate from these things. It used them. It passed through them. As the siege began, the Crusaders were caught between desperation and expectation. They had come too far to retreat. They were too weak to wait indefinitely. They were too convinced of divine favor to accept that Jerusalem might remain closed. Their leaders had to act before thirst and fatigue destroyed the army from within. The final days before the assault carried a ritual intensity. The Crusaders performed acts of devotion, including penitential processions around the city, echoing biblical memory and shaping their military effort as sacred drama. To modern eyes, such gestures may seem symbolic beside the brutal mechanics of siege warfare. To them, symbolism was part of the mechanics. The army needed not only ladders, but certainty. It needed the confidence that heaven stood with those climbing the walls. This was not decoration. It was morale made visible. Yet we should remember what such certainty meant for those inside Jerusalem. For the Crusaders, the city was a promise. For its inhabitants, it was home, refuge, and impending disaster. The same walls that appeared to one side as the barrier to salvation appeared to the other as the last protection against an army hardened by years of suffering and religious conviction. The Crusaders had been shaped by the road. Now the road would shape what they did at its end. By July 1099, the Holy City was no longer distant, no longer imagined, no longer safely contained in sermons. It stood under siege, surrounded by men who believed their sins, their dead, their hunger, and their God had brought them there. And when such men finally enter the place they have turned into the meaning of their lives, victory does not arrive gently. Chapter 16. The Fall of the Holy City. Jerusalem fell in July 1099. For the Crusaders, This was the moment toward which every sermon, vow, hunger, argument, and grave had been moving. The walls that had turned sacred longing into siege work were finally breached. Men who had crossed Europe and Asia Minor, who had survived Nicaea, Dorylaeum, Antioch, thirst, disease, and despair, now poured into the city that had lived in their minds as the center of the world. To them, it was victory. To those inside, it was catastrophe. The capture of Jerusalem is one of those moments where the language of triumph becomes difficult to bear. Medieval Christian sources often describe the Crusaders' success in religious terms as the fulfillment of divine favor after almost impossible suffering. But those same accounts and later testimony also preserve the memory of massacre. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed. The city was taken by storm, and storming a city in medieval warfare often meant terror for those trapped inside. The horror should not be inflated for effect. It does not need to be. What matters is the contradiction. The Crusaders entered Jerusalem as pilgrims and conquerors at the same time. They had come seeking the places associated with Christ's suffering and resurrection. They had come under a promise of remission. They had come believing the road itself was an act of penance. And when they finally reached the place they regarded as holy beyond all others, they marked their arrival with blood. This is the wound at the center of the First Crusade, not simply that violence happened. Violence had followed the movement from the beginning. Not simply that people killed in the name of religion. That, too, had already been revealed in Europe. The deeper wound is that many crusaders could apparently move from slaughter to devotion without seeing those acts as opposites. After the city fell, some went to pray at the Holy Sepulchre. That image is almost impossible to hold steadily. Warriors weeping before sacred sites, giving thanks for divine mercy, while the city around them carried the immediate aftermath of conquest. To a modern conscience, the contrast feels unbearable. To many crusaders, may have felt like completion. They had suffered. They had fought. They had been tested. They had entered Jerusalem. Now prayer was not hypocrisy to them. It was the purpose of the violence. This is where we must be careful not to make the past too easy. It is tempting to stand at a distance and say simply that they were monsters. Some committed monstrous acts, but if we stop there, we protect ourselves from understanding how ordinary moral categories can be rearranged. The frightening lesson of Jerusalem is not that people without faith can be cruel. Everyone knows that. The frightening lesson is that people with intense faith, public vows, and sincere longing for salvation can commit cruelty while believing they are moving deeper into holiness. That is much harder to face. The fall of Jerusalem did not come from sudden madness. It came from years of preparation, spiritual, social, military, and emotional. The Crusaders had been told that their violence could serve God. They had endured so much that survival itself seemed miraculous. They had seen enemies not merely as political opponents, but as obstacles in a sacred drama. By the time they entered Jerusalem, many had learned to interpret bloodshed as part of redemption's cost. Meaning had done its work. And once meaning changes, the same act can appear transformed. A killing that would have been condemned in one setting could be praised in another. A siege could become pilgrimage. A massacre could be folded into victory. Tears of prayer could fall beside bodies without, in the Crusaders' mind, canceling the prayer. That does not absolve them. It explains the machinery. Inside Jerusalem were real communities: Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, families, scholars, merchants, servants, elders, children. The crusading imagination had carried Jerusalem for years as a sacred symbol, but symbols do not bleed. Cities do. When the dream finally met the living city, the dream proved stronger than recognition. This is one of the dangers of holy conquest. It can love a place while refusing to see the people who inhabit it. The Crusaders believed they had recovered Jerusalem for Christendom. In their world, this was not merely a strategic victory, but a cosmic correction. The city that had felt lost to Christian imagination was now in Latin Christian hands. The journey that seemed impossible had succeeded. Against hunger, fear, rivalries, deserts, and powerful enemies, the crusade had reached its promised end. No wonder they saw God's hand. No wonder later chroniclers shaped the victory as miracle. But victory is not the same as innocence. A terrible part of the First Crusade's power lies in the fact that its participants could see themselves as both sinners and chosen instruments. They did not need to believe they were morally perfect. In fact, the promise of remission assumed they were not. They could see their own weakness, guilt, and brutality, and still believe that God had used them. Perhaps that made the violence easier to bear. Perhaps it made remorse harder. Jerusalem gave the crusade its answer, but not a peaceful one. The city fell. The pilgrims prayed. The dead remained. And from that moment, the First Crusade could no longer be only a movement of longing. It had become a conquest with consequences: land to govern, enemies to fight, allies to disappoint, and memories that would harden on every side. The road that opened at Clermont had reached its destination, but it had not ended. It had built a throne on a wound. Chapter 17. A kingdom built on a wound. Victory created a new problem. The Crusaders had reached Jerusalem. They had taken the city. They had prayed at the sacred places that had filled their imaginations for years. The vow had found its destination, and for many who survived, that might have seemed like the end of the story. But conquest is never an ending. It is a beginning with walls around it. The Crusaders now faced a question that had been waiting behind every sermon and siege. What does a holy army do after it wins? A pilgrimage can end when the pilgrim reaches the shrine. An army can disband when the campaign is over. But a conquered city must be governed. Roads must be guarded. Food must be secured. Local populations must be managed. Enemies must be watched. Allies must be reassured or ignored or betrayed carefully enough to avoid immediate disaster. Jerusalem had been recovered in the language of heaven. Now it had to survive in the language of administration. The result was the formation of Latin Christian rule in the Levant, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states that emerged around the same period, such as Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. These were not fantasy kingdoms planted neatly into empty land. They were fragile political structures created in a region already full of older powers, communities, rivalries, and traditions. Latin rulers arrived as conquerors, but they were few. Their survival depended on fortifications, military orders later on, alliances, truces, trade, local knowledge, and a constant awareness that victory had not made them secure. This is one of the great ironies of 1099. The Crusaders had won the city they believed God wanted them to reach, but the success left them surrounded by realities no miracle had removed. They had to govern Muslims. Eastern Christians, Jews where communities remained or later returned, and other local groups whose lives did not begin with the arrival of Western armies. They had to work with people whose languages, customs, and political habits were unfamiliar. They had to decide how much to impose and how much to adapt. They had to live not as passing pilgrims, but as rulers in a land where they were newcomers. That transition changed the meaning of the Crusade. Before Jerusalem, the movement could imagine itself as a road. After Jerusalem, it became a frontier. A road has a destination. A frontier has no final day. Godfrey of Bouillon emerged as the leading ruler in Jerusalem, though he famously did not take the title of king in the most straightforward form. Later memory would polish him into an image of pious restraint. But the practical issue was clear enough. Someone had to hold the city. Someone had to command defense, distribute power, negotiate loyalty, and give Latin rule a shape. When Godfrey died not long after, Baldwin would take the kingship more explicitly, and the new political order began to look less like a temporary guardianship and more like a kingdom. The sacred conquest was becoming hereditary power. This should not surprise us. Medieval people did not see land, lordship, and devotion as separate categories. A ruler could genuinely believe he held territory in service to God while also building family power. A noble house could treat a crusader state as both spiritual responsibility and political prize. Again, faith and ambition traveled together, not as enemies but as partners with different vocabularies. Yet the new states were vulnerable from the beginning. The armies that had captured Jerusalem were not large enough to fill the land securely. Many crusaders considered their vows fulfilled and returned home. That makes sense. They had reached the holy city, prayed, and survived. Their estates, families, debts, and obligations waited in Europe. For them, remaining permanently in the East was not part of the original promise. But every departure weakened the conquest. Those who stayed inherited a victory too large for their numbers. They needed settlers, soldiers, money, horses, ships, and reinforcements. They needed the Mediterranean to remain open enough for supplies and pilgrims. They needed Western enthusiasm to continue after the emotional climax had passed. They needed to survive among Muslim powers that were divided in 1099, but would not remain harmless forever. The Crusader states were built on a wound, and wounds draw attention. For Muslims in the region, the fall of Jerusalem was a shock. Though the immediate response was shaped by political division, the Crusaders had benefited from a lack of unified opposition. Local rulers had their own priorities. The wider Islamic world did not instantly answer with one voice. But memory works slowly. The Latin presence created a new grievance and a new strategic problem. Over time, the idea of resisting and reversing Crusader conquest would grow in force. The conquest also deepened the strain with Byzantium. The issue had been present from the start. What lands recovered by the Crusaders should be returned to imperial authority? Antioch became the most obvious source of bitterness. Bohemon's claim to the city clashed with Byzantine expectations and earlier oaths. From the Western perspective, Byzantine support had not matched the Crusaders' suffering. From the Byzantine perspective, oath-breaking and Norman ambition looked exactly like the danger Alexios had feared. Both sides carried their own account of betrayal, and both accounts had enough truth to survive. This matters because the First Crusade is sometimes remembered as a moment when Latin Christendom triumphed in the East. But its victory also planted distrust among Christians. The Crusade had promised unity, yet it left behind disputes over sovereignty, loyalty, and legitimacy. The Latin East did not become a bridge between Rome and Constantinople, as much as a contested zone where cooperation and resentment lived side by side. The spiritual consequences were just as lasting. The success of the First Crusade seemed to prove that armed pilgrimage could work. That is difficult to overstate. If the expedition had failed at Antioch, crusading might have remained a tragic experiment. But Jerusalem fell. For Latin Christians, this victory gave the idea of crusade enormous authority. It suggested that vows, remission, papal leadership, and sanctified violence could reshape the world. Success made the model repeatable, and that may have been the most consequential result of all. A failed holy war can be mourned, explained, or abandoned. A successful one becomes precedent. It gives later generations a script: preach, vow, march, fight, suffer, conquer, remember. The capture of Jerusalem did not simply create a kingdom in the Levant. It created an argument that future popes, princes, preachers, and warriors could use again. The sword had prayed, and the city had fallen. For those who believed, that was evidence. For those who suffered under the conquest, it was disaster. For history, it was a door left open. The new kingdom of Jerusalem stood as both triumph and warning. It was a monument to endurance, faith, and military astonishing luck, and also to massacre, displacement, mistrust, and the dangerous ease with which sacred language can bless possession. It was not stable peace after holy victory. It was a fortified uncertainty, a Latin Christian island of power surrounded by peoples who had their own memories, claims, and griefs. The Crusaders had wanted Jerusalem to resolve the meaning of their journey. Instead, Jerusalem multiplied meanings. To Western pilgrims, it became proof that God had favored the impossible. To Latin settlers, it became a home and a responsibility. To Muslim powers, it became an injury. To Byzantium, it became part of a broader pattern of Western unreliability. To Jewish memory, after the Rhineland and Jerusalem, it belonged to a season of catastrophe. To later generations, it became myth. And myths are not quiet things. They recruit the future. So the First Crusade did not end in 1099. Not really. It hardened into institutions, borders, vows, grievances, stories, and expectations. It left behind a kingdom that could only survive by remaining armed, and a sacred victory that made more sacred wars imaginable. The pilgrims had reached the tomb, but they had also founded a frontier. Chapter 18. The War That Changed the Meaning of Faith. The First Crusade began with a sermon and ended with a new language of power. Before Clermont, Europe already knew violence. It knew raids, feuds, siege, hunger, ambition, and fear. It knew knights who fought too easily, and churchmen who tried to restrain them. What changed was not the existence of war. War was old. What changed was the confidence that war could become pilgrimage, that killing could be joined to penance, that a sword carried under the cross might help cleanse the soul that held it. That idea did not vanish after Jerusalem. It survived because the Crusade succeeded. The capture of the Holy City gave Latin Christendom a story it could repeat to itself. God had called, sinners had marched, suffering had purified them, and victory had confirmed the cause. This interpretation was powerful, but also dangerous, because it made success look like proof of righteousness. It encouraged later generations to imagine sacred violence not as an emergency contradiction, but as a tool that could be used again. The consequences spread in many directions. The papacy gained a model for commanding action across borders. Warriors gained a way to attach salvation to combat. The Latin East became a permanent frontier of anxiety and aspiration. Relations between Christians and Muslims hardened around memories of conquest, atrocity, resistance, and loss. Violence against Jews in Europe exposed how quickly the language of holy war could turn inward, finding enemies not only beyond the frontier, but inside Christian society itself. And the divide between Eastern and Western Christians did not heal. The crusade that had partly answered a Byzantine plea also left behind mistrust, broken expectations, and disputes over conquered lands. It revealed that Christendom was not one body moving with one mind, but a collection of rival powers able to share prayers while disagreeing bitterly over territory, honor, and authority. This is why the First Crusade remains so haunting. It cannot be reduced to greed, though greed was present. It cannot be reduced to faith, though faith was real. It cannot be explained only as papal strategy, knightly aggression, popular fear, or Byzantine diplomacy. It was all of these at once, gathered into a movement that gave ordinary suffering and ordinary violence an extraordinary frame. That frame changed what people thought war could mean. For some, the crusade became the proof that God might bless armed conquest. For others, it became a memory of devastation. For the communities destroyed along the way, no theology could make the loss sacred. For those who survived and prayed in Jerusalem, the journey may have seemed like mercy. The same event became triumph, trauma, miracle, crime, and myth, depending on where one stood when the banners passed. History rarely gives us clean endings. It gives us inheritances. The First Crusade left an inheritance of fortified borders, repeated expeditions, deepened suspicion, and stories that later ages would polish, weaponize, condemn, or romanticize. It showed how a religious movement could call people beyond themselves, inspiring sacrifice and endurance, while also narrowing their vision until neighbors and strangers became obstacles in a divine drama. That is the central warning. Religion did not simply turn Europe toward war. Europe was already armed. It was already fractured. It was already restless beneath its crosses and castles. What the crusade did was give war a language of salvation. And once war learned to speak that language, it became much harder to silence.